So, hello everyone. I'll be speaking today on behalf of our small self-isolating for obvious reasons team. And the first thing I would like to do is to wish you all be well and healthy. And our talk today, as you may see, is going to be about Pragmatic Markers Database, developing speech technologies for everyday spoken discourse. This is the project supported financially by the Russian Science Foundation, and you can see the reference in the slide. So at first, we are going to speak about pragmatic markers themselves that we study. Pragmatic markers are a group of elements within a bigger class of auxiliary units of oral discourse that are frequently used in oral speech, and most of them are the result of pragmaticalization. What we mean by pragmaticalization is that grammar forms or individual words pass on to communicative pragmatic level of the language and become purely pragmatic units. And this process can be accompanied by changes in their use, such as changes in valency and some non-standard word order. And as a result, it is the function of the unit which it performs in the structure of oral discourse, and which can be called the pragmatic meaning of this unit, that becomes the main aspect of the pragmaticalized unit. Pragmatic markers, as I've already said, they are characteristic of unprepared, spontaneous oral speech, both in monologues and dialogues. And they are extremely frequent in our everyday communication. Well, sometimes they depend in their use on the individual speaker preferences, on social relations of the interlocutors, or the communicative situation itself. And thus, we desperately need detailed consideration and very careful description of these pragmatic markers, and we need to fix them in a special dictionary of pragmatic units. So the global aim of this study is to describe the pragmatic markers system for Russian everyday speech as a whole, as an important and integral part of oral discourse. And thus we have a lot of objectives. And the first one is to create general classification of these pragmatic markers. And on the basis of this classification, we need to annotate the actual speech material, and we need to get specific numerical data on the conditions and the features of the pragmatic markers use, and then get statistical data on pragmatic markers distribution in natural speech, depending on different factors. Here in this slide, we see the data about two speech corpora that we are using. I won't be going in too much detail because they are in the slide, but what's important is that the first corpus, or the corpus of Russian everyday speech, aka one day of speech, and the other one is SAT corpus, balanced annotated collection of texts. So the first one is not only dialogues, but there are lots of dialogues. And the SAT corpus, that's monologues. So we can compare the use of pragmatic markers in dialogical and monological speech. About pragmatic markers annotation, again, as you might see from this slide, they are annotated at multiple levels. And here in this kind of reddish brick, you can see level 2 function of pragmatic markers, which will be especially important for our talk today. Some very general data about the material is that for one day of speech corpus, we have annotated 136 communicative macro episodes, and for the SAT corpus, that's 170 monologues. And the total number of speakers in the annotated subcorpus is 257 for the ORD and 34 for the SAT corpus. Now, for some of the phonetic features of pragmatic markers, there was selective annotation. It's for those pragmatic markers that have similar use positions with their lexical counterparts. Thus, material was obtained for comparing the phonetic realization of the pragmatic marker and that of its lexical analog. And the phonetic annotation was performed for 70 macro episodes of the ORD corpus. You can see again that the annotation was carried out at several levels. Particularly important are levels from 6 to 11, most of them being done in FRUCT program. So that's the duration in milliseconds of the pragmatic marker, the melody movement, the pitch difference, frequency difference in the stressed vowel, duration of the stressed vowel in milliseconds, the abruptness of the basic voice pitch frequency, change in the stressed vowel, well, that was calculated in Excel, and the position of the pragmatic marker in the utterance, which can be different. It can be used isolated, it can be put at the beginning of the phrase, at the end of the phrase, or inside the phrase. And that was also done in Excel. Now about the structure of the database of pragmatic markers. Two basic tables that are related to the description of speakers and episodes were imported from ORD corpus with minimal adaptation. That's the thing that we already had. However, if we are speaking about the SAT corpus, the tables and the full catalog of the corpus were created for the first time as part of this particular project. And for One Day of Speech corpus, for the first time, its data were correlated with the psychological information about the infants. The two tables, SAT pilot subset or ORD pilot subset, they represent a sample on which pilot pragmatic markers annotation was performed in the amount of 15,000 word usages for the SAT corpus and 75,000 word usages for the ORD corpus. That's the third and the fourth stage of pilot annotating. And the results of the first two stages of the pilot annotation, which were performed simultaneously by 4 experts, are in the tables PM annotation V1 and PM annotation V2. The results of the third and the fourth stages of the pilot annotation can be found in the tables SAT PM annotation and ORD PM annotation. So now we'll have several slides that I'll be briefly going through because they are all of the same times. They represent all these tables that were created. So the first one is table of SAT episodes. And the second one, table SAT pilot subset, that's corpus, the SAT corpus prepared for pilot annotation of pragmatic markers. Again, you can see all the fields that were filled in. Now, the third table, that's SAT PM annotation, the results of the pilot annotation of the monologue speech. Tables 4 and 5, they are of the same type and have similar structure. They reflect the results of the first 2 stages of pilot annotation. And again, you can see for yourself the description fields if you are interested. Table 6, that's for ORD speaker subcorpus. So that's information about the informants and the interlocutors. Quite a lot of it, as you see. These are gender information, age information, their place of birth intonation, their languages that we speak, and so on and so forth. Table 7, that's psychotypes. That's information on the psychological characteristic of the informants for the ORD corpus that was obtained as a result of psychological tests processing. Number 8, that's ORD episodes table. That's information about macro episodes of everyday speech communication from this corpus. And again, you can see for yourself the description parameters. Number 9, that's stable OLD pilot subset. That's subsample of pilot annotation for this corpus and displays information which of the files from the ORD were used during this stage of pilot annotation. And finally, number 10, that's stable ORD-PM annotation. Again, you can see the details yourself. Now let's talk in more detail about the database. The results of expert annotation of pragmatic markers were put into this database, and the marked pragmatic markers annotation levels were downloaded from the ELAN program into Microsoft Excel, combined in Microsoft Excel with automatic postmarkings and expert annotation data in the form of a table, and then converted into Microsoft Access tables. Thus, the database was expanded due to the introduction of new tables. ORD PM 30000 PM dialogic speech, that's 300,000 tokens. SAT PM 50000 PM monological speech, that's 50,000 tokens. Phone PM PRAT, results of selective phonetic annotation. FL POS, correlation of basic pragmatic markers variants with canonical parts of speech, and so on and so forth. The database was formed for the entire annotated corpus material. So for dialogical speech, that's 321,504 tokens. And for the monological speech, that's 50,128 tokens. In the database, information from annotation files is correlated with information about, first of all, type of communicative scenario and other conditions of communication, and also with the social and psychological characteristics of the speakers. So as a result, new database tables were obtained. Those are ORD-PM ComScene, ORD-PM Socio, which allows studying the use of pragmatic markers for different social acts, psychological types of a speaker, and for different communicative situations in oral speech. So in this slides, we are going to speak about frequency lists of pragmatic markers. And here you can see the results for statistical processing of the pragmatic markers expert annotation. I'll be showing you in the next slides the data on frequency of different kinds. So the first, we'll be talking about frequency lists of pragmatic markers for the whole sample. Then we'll take dialogical speech. Then we'll take monological speech, and finally, statistical distribution of the main pragmatic functional types, both in dialogues and monologues. So on the basis of all annotated material, we found 356 pragmatic markers variants. And the total share of pragmatic markers in speech is 2.77%. Out of the total number of pragmatic markers, 82 variants were recorded both in dialogical and monological speech. And in this slide, you can see for yourself the most frequent pragmatic markers variants. And their relative frequency in brackets is indicated in IPM. Now, numerous pragmatic markers variations are an implementation of 59 standard or basic pragmatic forms. Of the total number of standard pragmatic markers forms, 25 can be seen both in dialogues and monologues. And again, you can see the most frequent ones on the slide. In total, 315 variants of pragmatic markers were registered in everyday dialogical speech. And the total share of pragmatic markers in dialogical speech was slightly larger than the average for the two samples. And again, you can see in this slide the most common options for the dialogical speech. Now, if we compare it with the monologues, we'll see that in total, in monologues, 134 variants of pragmatic markers were registered. The smaller number of variants can be explained by a significantly smaller sample size, of course. 50,000 word usages in SAT versus 300,000 word usages in ORD corpus. The total share of pragmatic markers in monological speech turned out to be slightly less than in dialogical speech, 2.57%. And again, you can see in this slide the most common options for monologues. And finally, let's look at statistical distribution of the main pragmatic markers functional types. First, for dialogues. For dialogues, you can see here in this slide the most common functions, and they are split into two subcategories. The first one is monofunctional usages, and B point is for multifunctional usages. And the next slide is about monological speech. And again, you can see the most common functions split into two subgroups for monofunctional and multifunctional usages. Now, if we compare dialogical speech and monological speech, we can see in this table the difference in the functions that are more characteristic of dialogues and monologues. So for dialogues, we mostly have metacommunicative markers, markers approximators, deictic markers, xenomarkers, border delimitation plus metacommunicative, border delimitation plus metacommunicative combined with hesitative function, and rhythm-forming markers. While for monologues, that's mostly border delimitation plus hesitation, or just hesitation, or approximator plus hesitation, and finally, deictic plus hesitative. If we now look at the database of illustrative examples, we should say that we created a list of illustrative examples for the pragmatic markers used. And this base of examples is presented in two versions as a table for Microsoft Excel, in Microsoft Excel, and as a corpus of sound files in WAV format. And examples of the pragmatic markers used were taken from both speech corpora. You can see in this slide the main selection criteria. That was an ambiguity of assigning the unit to the category of pragmatic markers, and if possible, that there are no homonyms of the functions for this pragmatic marker, and the quality of the speech fragment itself, which was recorded in the field. Sometimes there can be noise and some other discrepancies. Now you can see the table and the description fields that were included in the table for illustrative examples. And the resulting list of examples will be finally used as illustrative material in the upcoming multimedia dictionary of pragmatic markers of Russian everyday speech that we are going to create. Now, let's talk about correlations of the pragmatic markers use with different factors. The combination of pragmatic annotation with the meta information of the sound recordings in both corpora allows us to study the use of pragmatic markers in different social acts, by speakers of various psychological types and in different communicative situation in our everyday communication. So for instance, if we look at such functional types as metacommunicatives or xenomarkers, we'll see that they are found in women's speech much more often than in male speech, for instance. So we're ready for the conclusion. The database that we're creating is an accumulating resource, where the data from a wide variety of categories are gathered and combined, and it provides basic information about the two speech corpora that are used in this study. This is the one day of speech corpus, mostly dialects, and SAT corpus, monologues. So one can correlate various kinds of information, linguistic information, pragmatic, extra-linguistic information, and so on, and in particular, the results of expert annotation and the communicative conditions of the corresponding speech episode. An important result of the research is statistics on pragmatic markers used in Russian spoken language. So there's a list of the main functional types of pragmatic markers. There's empirical data on the frequencies of the basic or standard pragmatic markers versions. There's data on specific usages of these basic types. And there's statistics on the use of pragmatic markers in speech of various types. And these quantitative data are to be used for theoretical studies of everyday Russian and spoken discourse in general, and also there can be some practical application for the improvement of spoken NLP systems and speech technologies. And if we speak about the prospects for further research, this study of communicative alignment in the use of pragmatic markers can be carried out. So we can look into interactive adjustment of the speech behavior of communication participants. And we can find out about multifunctional pragmatic markers more, those that are capable of performing various pragmatic and procedural functions, both in monologues and dialogues. We can analyze differences in the use of pragmatic markers that have some the same lexical and grammatical composition, but perform different functions. We can build synonymous series of pragmatic markers that can perform homogeneous functions in speech. We can study the sequences, chains of pragmatic markers and how they are organized and work, and look into correlations between the function of the multifunctional pragmatic marker and its position in the utterance, and also study structural variability of pragmatic markers, including phonetic variability, and among others, the ability to undergo phonetic reduction and lexicogrammatic variability. So here's the slides with our references. First, then continuation, and finally. And thank you very much for your attention. Bye.